The microphone was still warm in my hand when Diane stood up at table 6 and asked everyone to wait before the toasts continued. I remember thinking, that's strange, because Diane doesn't speak at parties. She corrects people quietly, over wine, never in front of a crowd. But there she was, in a navy mother of the groom dress she'd had tailored twice, holding a folded piece of paper like she was about to read out a eulogy. Before we go further, she said, I think Sarah owes this family some clarity about Lindquist Design Studio. That was my company, 11 years old. Registered in Madison, Wisconsin, 2 blocks from the Capitol building, in a converted print shop on East Wilson Street. Diane had never once asked to see the books. She'd never asked anything about it beyond polite chit-chat at Thanksgiving. She unfolded the paper. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm Sarah, and you're watching Beyond Truth Revealed. Hit subscribe and join our growing community. Now, here's what happened. I've had my attorney draw up something simple, she said. A 51% transfer of ownership, as a wedding gift, to Tyler. Tyler was my son. The room, maybe 90 people. String lights over the reception tent at the Olbrich Botanical Gardens went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when nobody wants to be the first to laugh or gasp. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I have spent 11 years building a business out of a P&L spreadsheet and a second-hand drafting table, and I have learned that the worst thing you can do in front of people who are trying to humiliate you is give them a reaction worth filming. What I did instead was ask her a question. Diane, I said, where did you get a copy of my operating agreement? She didn't answer that, not then. She just smiled the way she smiles at church when someone sings off key, and said, we're just trying to keep things fair for Tyler's future. Tyler, my son, 26, an electrical engineer at a firm out by the airport, was sitting 2 seats down from her, and his face told me everything. He was just as confused as I was. Maybe more, but his new wife, Brianna, wasn't confused at all. She was looking at her napkin like it was the most interesting napkin in Dane County. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing who I actually am. I'm 52. I started Lindquist Design Studio in 2015 in my unfinished basement on Gorham Street, doing branding work for 2 dentists and a regional credit union. I named it after my grandmother, Astrid Lindquist, who came over from Bergen in 1958 and worked at a button factory in Beloit for 30 years without ever once complaining where I could hear it. By the time of the wedding, the studio had 9 employees, a lease on Wilson Street, and clients that included a regional hospital system and 3 breweries that actually paid their invoices on time, which in that business is its own small miracle. I am divorced. Tyler's father, Mark, left when Tyler was 9, moved to Tucson, and now sends a card at Christmas that always arrives in February. I raised Tyler mostly alone, in a 2-bedroom rental on Spate Street, doing freelance logo work at the kitchen table after he went to bed. Diane is Brianna's mother, not mine. Not blood to me at all. She runs a boutique real estate office in Middleton that specializes in lakefront properties, and she has, in 11 months of knowing her, mentioned the square footage of her own house in at least 4 separate conversations. I liked her fine before the wedding. Cordial. A little stiff. The kind of relationship where you compliment each other's shoes and never go deeper than that. So when she stood up holding a legal document with my company's name on it, the first thing I felt wasn't fury. It was a very specific, very cold question. How does she even know what percentage to ask for? The second crack came about 90 seconds later, when Brianna finally looked up from her napkin. Mom, she said quietly, I told you not to do this here. Not I told you not to do this. Not what are you talking about, not here. Which meant somewhere else, at some other time, this conversation had already happened. Which meant my new daughter-in-law had known about this before I'd even cut the cake. I looked at Tyler. He looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old and broke a neighbor's window and didn't know how to tell me. Mom, he said. I didn't know she was going to bring this up tonight. I swear. I believed him. I still believe him, for what that's worth. But tonight wasn't the part that bothered me. It was the word bring up. Like this wasn't new information. Like this was a plan that had a folder somewhere, with a date on it, and the date wasn't today. I run a business that depends entirely on contracts being airtight. I have read more operating agreements than most attorneys I know personally. And I knew, standing there in heels, I'd be regretting by 10 o'clock that whatever Diane was holding in her hand had not been drafted that afternoon. Someone had been working on this for a while. I just didn't yet know who. Diane was still holding the paper out like she expected me to walk up and take it in front of 90 guests and a hired photographer named Renata, who I had specifically asked to capture candid moments. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said. And I'm not discussing my business at a wedding. It's not just your business anymore, is it? Diane said. Not once you married into family. I hadn't married into anything. Tyler had. But I let that sit, because correcting her grammar in front of the DJ booth wasn't going to help me. My sister Pam, who'd flown in from Eau Claire and was 3 seats down nursing, what I'm fairly sure was her second old-fashioned, stood up before I could say anything else. Diane, sweetheart, sit down, Pam said, in the same voice she uses on her golden retriever when he gets into the trash. Nobody asked for a business proposal at a wedding. A few people laughed. Not many. Most of the room was still doing the math on what they'd just watched. Diane sat. But she set the paper down on the table in front of her, not in her purse, not folded away. Set it down like she was leaving it there on purpose, like a chess piece she intended to pick back up later. I caught the eye of my studio's office manager, Renee, who'd come as my +1 since I was between anyone worth bringing. Renee mouthed one word at me across the tent. Later, she was right. Later. Not here, the toasts continued, because that's what you do. The band played, people danced badly to a song about Tennessee whiskey, and I smiled for 2 more hours like a woman whose company hadn't just been quietly threatened in front of her son's new in-laws. It was around 11, near the gift table, that I found the second piece of the puzzle. Brianna's father, Carl, was a quiet man who worked in something related to commercial lending. I'd never gotten the specifics, and frankly hadn't cared to ask before that night. He came up to me near the cake table, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else, and said something that didn't fit. For what it's worth, Carl said, I told Diane this wasn't the way to handle a buyout conversation. Buyouts go through proper channels. Buyout, not gift, not transfer, buyout. Carl, I said carefully, nobody has approached me about a buyout, of anything. He looked uncomfortable in a way that told me he believed he'd already said too much, and also that he wasn't entirely wrong to feel that way. Diane's been talking to someone at your bank, he said. I assumed you knew. I did not know. Lindquist Design Studio banked at a regional credit union on Monroe Street, the same one that had been a client of mine for 6 years before they became my own bank, mostly because the relationship manager there, a man named Greg Hassan, had always been straightforward with me about everything, from a line of credit to a commercial mortgage on the Wilson Street building. Greg would not talk to my son's mother-in-law about my finances, not without my signature on a release. I'd have staked the business on it, but somebody had given Diane numbers. The 51% wasn't a guess. It was specific enough to suggest she knew exactly what stake would put her, or Tyler, or someone, in controlling position. Controlling position over what, though, was the part I still couldn't place. The studio wasn't for sale. I'd never said it was for sale. I had no debt that would force a sale, no health scare, no reason on paper for anyone to think ownership was up for negotiation, unless someone had decided it should be, and built the case before telling me. I drove home that night to my house on Spate Street alone, since Renee had her own ride, with the windows cracked because I needed air more than I needed warmth, and I kept circling back to one detail that didn't belong with the rest. Diane had said, "We're just trying to keep things fair for Tyler's future." We. Not I think. I'd assumed standing there in the tent that we meant her and her husband Carl. But Carl had just told me, by the cake table, that he'd argued against the whole thing. So who was the other half of we? I thought about Tyler's face when his mother-in-law stood up. Confused. Caught off guard, the way I'd been caught off guard. And then I thought about Brianna's napkin and the 4 words she'd said to her mother under her breath. "I told you not to do this here. Not I told you not to do this here." There was a version of this plan, somewhere, that Brianna had agreed to happening somewhere else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd done freelance logos at when Tyler was small, and I pulled up my business email on my laptop, scrolling back through 6 months of correspondence, looking for anything I might have missed. Some message. Some meeting I'd taken without realizing what it actually was. And around 1 a.m., I found an email I'd nearly deleted in October without reading past the subject line. It was from an address I didn't recognize, sent to my studio's general inbox. Subject line: regarding Lindquist Design Studio. Time sensitive. I had marked it as spam 4 months ago. I had never opened it. The email was from a name I didn't know. Patricia Voss, with a signature block underneath identifying her as a senior associate at a firm called Halvorsen and Reyes, out of an office on University Avenue. The subject line had made me assume, back in October, that it was some kind of vendor solicitation. We get those constantly. Printing reps, software resellers, people wanting to sell us growth consulting. I never opened it. I just marked it spam and moved on with a Tuesday that had 3 client calls and a broken printer. At 1 a.m. the night of the wedding, I finally read it. It wasn't a sales pitch. It was a formal inquiry on behalf of an undisclosed client, expressing interest in acquiring a controlling stake in Lindquist Design Studio. Patricia had asked politely, professionally, for a call to discuss valuation and family succession planning options. Family succession planning. I sat with that phrase for a long time. I don't have a family succession plan because I'd never told anyone the business was something to be planned around. Tyler had his own career. He'd never once asked to come work for me, and I'd never offered, because watching him grow up in the gap left by his father had taught me that some things you don't push onto your kids. You let them choose, or they spend years resenting you for deciding their life before they did. So if someone was asking about succession, they weren't asking because Tyler wanted in. They were asking because someone wanted Tyler in, whether he'd said so or not. I forwarded the email to myself with a note, then did something I almost never do at 1 a.m. I called Renee. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she hadn't been asleep either. "I found something," I said. "October, an acquisition inquiry. I never saw it." "Sarah," Renee said, "you need to call Greg first thing, not the office line. His cell." I called Greg Hassan at 8:40 the next morning, technically before business hours, technically rude, and he picked up anyway, because 11 years of an honest relationship buys you that. "I need to ask you something uncomfortable," I said. "Has anyone contacted the credit union about my accounts? My loan terms? Anything?" There was a pause that told me more than whatever he said next. "There was an inquiry," Greg said carefully, "back in the fall. Someone claiming to represent a family member, asking general questions about commercial lending relationships. I didn't disclose anything, you know I wouldn't. But I did confirm we bank you." "That's public record territory anyway, Sarah." "It's tied to the property filing on Wilson Street." "Who asked?" "I didn't get a name. It came through our front desk, not me directly. I only heard about it secondhand. That detail mattered more than it sounds like it should. Someone hadn't called Greg. They'd gone around him, to whoever was easiest to reach, fishing for confirmation rather than information. That's not how you do a real acquisition. That's how you build a paper trail you can later point to and say, "See, I did my diligence," when what you're actually doing is building a narrative. I thanked Greg, hung up, and sat at my desk at the studio. I'd come in early alone. The building still smelling like the coffee Renee makes too strong on purpose. And I thought about what kind of person builds a narrative instead of asking a direct question. A real estate agent does. Someone who spends her working life assembling comps, building a case for a number before she ever sits across from a buyer, learns to gather facts quietly and present them all at once. Polished, undeniable. At the moment of maximum leverage, someone exactly like Diane, Tyler called me that afternoon. His voice had the flat, careful tone he gets when he's been crying and doesn't want me to know. Mom, I need you to know I had nothing to do with that email. I didn't know about any law firm. I didn't know about the bank thing. I swear to God. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Brianna's furious at her mom. She didn't sleep last night either. What did Brianna know? I asked. Tyler, I need you to actually tell me. Not protect her. Tell me. The silence on the line went on long enough that I knew the answer wasn't going to be nothing. She knew her mom wanted to talk to you about the business, he finally said. She thought it was going to be a normal conversation, like after the wedding, sit down, civil. She didn't know Diane already had paperwork drawn up. She found out about the law firm same as you did. Last night, in the car, on the way home, they had a huge fight about it. Brianna's saying she might not even go on the honeymoon if her mom doesn't apologize to you first. I believed that too, mostly because nobody fakes the kind of exhausted anger I could hear underneath my son's voice, but that still left the law firm. The bank inquiry. The number. 51%, not 60, not a vague majority, a number specific enough to guarantee a controlling vote on every decision the studio ever made again. Someone had done real homework. Someone had talked to Patricia Voss more than once. Because a first cold email in October doesn't end in a signed legal document by June without follow-up calls, drafts, revisions, Deanne ran a boutique real estate office. She didn't have the kind of money or legal infrastructure to retain a firm like Halvorsen and Reyes on her own for 8 months of quiet work, which meant somebody else had been paying for this. And late that night, going through the studio's old vendor files looking for anything connecting back to October, I found a name I hadn't thought about in 3 years, attached to an old consulting invoice that had nothing to do with weddings, mothers-in-law, or stock percentages at all. It was my ex-husband's name, Mark. The invoice was 3 years old, from a graphic supplies vendor in Phoenix, and it meant nothing on its own. A one-time order of presentation boards, paid by check signed by Mark Lindqvist. I'd kept the surname after the divorce. So had he, oddly, for reasons he'd once explained as easier for the business cards, though I never knew what business he meant. He'd left Madison 14 years ago and built a life in Tucson, doing something he described to people as consulting, which in my experience meant a rotating series of jobs that never quite worked out the way he said they would. I hadn't spoken to Mark directly in over 2 years. Our communication ran through email twice a year, usually about Tyler's birthday or holiday logistics. He had never once asked about the studio, not when I started it, not when it grew, not when a regional magazine ran a small feature on women-owned businesses in Dane County and put my face on page 14. So finding his name on an old invoice felt less like a clue and more like static, until I noticed the order had been shipped to an address in Middleton, Wisconsin, not Tucson. Middleton was Diane's office. I called Tyler again later that night and asked him a question I hated asking. Have you talked to your dad recently? In the last year? There was a pause. He came to the wedding rehearsal dinner, Mom. You knew that. I had known that. I'd seen Mark across the restaurant at the rehearsal dinner 2 nights before the wedding, shaken his hand because that's what you do, exchanged maybe 4 sentences about traffic on the interstate. I hadn't thought anything of it. Divorced parents show up to their kids' weddings. It's not remarkable. Did he and Diane talk? At the dinner or before? I mean, yeah, probably. They were both there for like 3 hours. Why? I didn't tell him about the invoice yet. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't understand it myself, and I'd learned a long time ago not to hand my son half a theory and watch him carry the weight of it before I even knew if it was true. What I did instead was call Patricia Voss directly, using the number from the bottom of her October email. She was surprised to hear from me. Pleasantly surprised, in the practiced way attorneys manage to sound pleased about almost anything. Ms. Lindquist, I'm glad you called. We've been hoping to set up that conversation about valuation. I'd like to know who retained you, I said. Before we go any further, there was the smallest pause, the kind that costs a careful person nothing, but tells you everything if you're listening for it. I'm not able to disclose that without my client's consent, she said. But I can tell you the inquiry was made on behalf of a family member with a legitimate interest in the company's ownership structure. A family member, I repeated. Whose family? I think that conversation is better had directly, Patricia said, which is lawyer for I've already said more than I should have. I sat with that phrase for 2 days. A family member with a legitimate interest. Diane wasn't family, not by blood, not by marriage, not by any definition that would hold up if you actually wrote it down on paper. Brianna was family, by marriage, through Tyler. Mark was family, Tyler's father, even 14 years gone. If Mark had been the one who hired Patricia Voss back in October, and Diane had simply been the one willing to stand up and deliver the ultimatum in person, then this wasn't a mother-in-law overreaching at a wedding. It was an ex-husband who had spent 14 years uninvolved in the business, deciding, the moment it became worth something, that he had a legitimate interest in it after all. And the only way Mark could plausibly claim that, the only legal hook that would make a real law firm take the inquiry seriously instead of laughing him off the phone, was something from the marriage itself. Something built or registered during the years we were still together. Something he could argue on paper he'd had a hand in funding. I started the business in 2015. We divorced in 2013. On paper, that should have ended any claim Mark could make, unless the paperwork didn't say what I remembered it saying. I drove to my storage unit on the east side that same night, the one I'd paid for since the divorce and never fully gone through, and pulled out the box marked Divorce. Final in my own handwriting from 13 years ago. I sat on the concrete floor under a bare bulb and started reading the settlement agreement page by page. For the first time since I'd signed it, looking for a clause I might have skimmed past, at 39 years old, exhausted, eager to be done, never once imagining that a sentence on page 11 could come back to threaten me at my son's wedding more than a decade later. I found it on page 11, a clause about future business interests arising from marital assets, with a 5-word phrase at the end I had no memory of agreeing to. I photographed the page with my phone, every page actually, sitting on the cold concrete of the storage unit until my hands were too stiff to hold the camera steady, and the next morning I drove straight to the office of the attorney who'd handled my divorce, a woman named Carol Pham, who'd since moved offices from downtown to a strip near West Town Mall. Carol read the clause twice before she said anything. "This is boilerplate language," she said. "It usually means nothing. It's meant to cover a scenario where one spouse starts a business using marital assets after separation, but before the divorce is finalized. Equipment, a shared account, something tangible. It is not supposed to mean someone gets a claim on a business built from scratch, years later with the other spouse's labor." "Supposed to," I repeated. "Supposed to," Carol agreed. "But Sarah, language like this gets weaponized by attorneys who know a judge has discretion to interpret it broadly if they can build a sympathetic enough story. And if Mark's attorney is arguing you used some piece of marital property, even something small, even your old laptop, even a shared credit card you didn't close out fast enough to get the studio off the ground, they can try to stretch this clause to mean more than it should." I thought about the laptop. The actual laptop. The one I'd done freelance logos on. At the kitchen table, when Tyler was small. The one Mark and I had bought together 2 years before he left. The one I never replaced because it still worked. And replacing things I didn't need to replace had never been my instinct. That laptop had been in the house when Mark moved out. It had been in the house, technically, on the date of the divorce filing, technically a marital asset, technically still in use the day I incorporated Lindquist Design Studio in 2015. It was a thin thread. But Carol's face told me thin threads were sometimes exactly what these cases were built on. This isn't really about the laptop, Carol said. It's about whether someone wants to spend money proving it is. That night, Tyler showed up at my house on Spate Street without calling first, which he hadn't done since he was a teenager forgetting his key. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. I talked to Dad, he said, standing in my kitchen, not sitting down. I asked him straight out if he hired some law firm to go after your business. What did he say? He didn't deny it right away. That's how I knew. Tyler's voice cracked on the word knew. He said, Mom, he said he helped get the conversation started because he thought it was overdue. Those were his exact words. Overdue. Overdue for what? For him to get something back. He said he gave up 14 years of being part of my life, so you could build that company without him in the way, and he thinks that's worth something now. I had to sit down for that one. Not because it was true. It wasn't. Not in any version of events I'd lived through, but because it told me, finally, what kind of story Mark had been telling himself for 14 years to make leaving feel survivable. He hadn't left and stayed gone because he wanted to. He'd left and somewhere along the way needed a reason that didn't make him the villain of his own life. I sacrificed so she could succeed was a much easier story than the truth, which was considerably simpler and far less generous to him. Diane and Dad talked at the rehearsal dinner, Tyler said. Brianna confirmed it. Dad told Diane about the laptop, the marital asset clause, all of it. Diane's the one who realized that if she pushed for ownership through me, through the marriage, through Brianna being family now, it would look less like Dad trying to grab money and more like a family arrangement nobody could object to. And the 51%? Tyler's jaw tightened. That part was Diane. Dad just wanted a settlement, money. Diane wanted control. She told Brianna once that family businesses are wasted on people who don't know how to grow them. I sat in my kitchen with my son, standing across from me, both of us quiet for a long moment, and I understood the shape of it now. 2 people, neither of whom had built one single thing inside Lindquist Design Studio, had spent 8 months constructing a legal argument to take more than half of it. One for money he felt owed, one for control she felt entitled to. And they had chosen my son's wedding day to deliver it, betting that grief, joy, and an audience would make me too disoriented to fight back cleanly. They had badly misjudged who they were dealing with. I looked at Tyler and said the only thing I was certain of in that entire moment. I need you to trust me for the next 2 weeks, I said. Don't talk to your dad about this again. Don't talk to Diane. Let me handle this the way I handle everything else that threatens this company. How are you going to handle it? Carefully, I said, and on paper. Always on paper. Carol Pham and I spent the better part of a week building a folder instead of an argument. That was her advice, and it matched my instinct exactly. Don't react to their story. Build a record so complete that their story collapses the moment it's read in full. The first thing we needed was the laptop itself. It was sitting in a closet in my spare bedroom, where it had been for 11 years, dead, unused, kept mostly out of the same instinct that had kept the divorce box in storage. Not sentiment, just an unwillingness to throw away anything that might matter later. A technician Carol referred me to, a methodical man named Dennis, who worked out of a small shop on Cottage Grove Road, pulled the drive and confirmed something I'd genuinely forgotten. The laptop had died for good in early 2014, 18 months before I incorporated. I'd bought a refurbished replacement at a Best Buy on the West Side using money from a freelance invoice, not joint funds, not marital property, paid for entirely after the divorce was final. Dennis printed me a service report with a timestamp. Carol called it the single most useful piece of paper in this entire matter. The second thing we needed was harder. We needed to show, in writing, where the money for the studio's earliest months had actually come from. Every invoice, every client check, every dollar, to prove the business had been built on my labor and my labor alone, with nothing that could plausibly be called a marital asset anywhere near its foundation. Renee helped me pull 11 years of records in 2 days. Fueled by the strong coffee and a grim kind of focus I recognized in her because it matched my own. The third thing we needed was something Carol called context the other side doesn't expect us to have. That part came from Greg Hassan, who, once he understood the shape of what was happening, offered to write a letter, voluntarily, not under any legal obligation, confirming the credit union's full lending relationship with the studio had begun in 2018, 3 years after incorporation, based entirely on the business's own financials. It wasn't required. It didn't need to be required. Greg had been my client once, long before he was my banker, and 11 years of being straightforward with people apparently still meant something to him. By the end of that week, I had a folder 2 inches thick that told one story, cleanly, with documentation behind every page. This business had never touched a marital asset, had never depended on Mark in any way, and had been built entirely after the divorce by a woman working alone at a kitchen table. The harder decision wasn't the paperwork. It was what to do with it. Carol's recommendation was conservative. Send a formal letter through her office to Patricia Voss, laying out the documentation, and let the legal pressure dissolve quietly, the way these things usually do once the other side realizes there's no real case. Quietly is the responsible move, Carol said. It protects you from looking vindictive if this ever needed to go in front of a judge. I told her I understood. I also told her I wasn't going to do it quietly. Sarah, she said, I want to be careful here. You have every right to be angry. But strategy and anger don't always point the same direction. This isn't anger, I said, though if I'm honest, some of it was. Diane stood up in front of 90 people and tried to take half my company before I'd even finished my first dance. She built a narrative in private for 8 months and chose to detonate it in public, in front of my son, in front of his new wife, in front of everyone I know. She doesn't get to do that and then have the actual resolution happen quietly in an attorney's office where nobody who watched her do it ever finds out she was wrong. Carol was quiet for a moment. That's not legal advice I can give you, she finally said, but I understand it. What I needed next wasn't a lawyer, it was an occasion. And it turned out one was already on the calendar, a family gathering Diane herself had organized 3 weeks out. A post-vote wedding brunch at her own house in Middleton meant, in her words to Brianna, to smooth things over as a family. Diane had picked the venue. Diane had picked the guest list, which included not just our immediate families, but several of her own friends from the Lake Association and 2 of her real estate colleagues, people who'd be impressed, presumably, by whatever gracious closing argument she planned to deliver about fairness and family. She had built herself a stage a second time without realizing I'd be using it too. I called Renee. I need the folder bound, I said. Professional. Copies for everyone who needs to see it. And I need you to come with me to Middleton in 3 weeks. What are you going to do? Renee asked. I'm going to let Diane finish her speech, I said. And then I'm going to give mine. Diane's house sat on a quiet street near Lake Mendota, the kind of lakefront lot she'd no doubt sold a dozen versions of to other people's clients before buying her own. The brunch was set up in her backyard, white folding chairs on the lawn. A caterer plating quiche under a tent canopy, maybe 25 people total. Smaller than the wedding, but the kind of smaller crowd that mattered more, because these were the people Diane saw every week. Her real estate colleagues. Her Lake Association friends. The people whose opinion of her she actually had to live inside of. Long after this morning ended, I brought Renee, the bound folder, and nothing else. No speech written out. I've learned over 11 years of client meetings that the moment you read from a script, people stop believing you mean it. Diane stood up just after the quiche was served, tapping a fork against her water glass like she was at a board meeting instead of a brunch. "I wanted to bring everyone together," she said, "because I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at the wedding, and I'd like the chance to clear the air as a family." She talked for almost 4 minutes. She used the word fairness 6 times. She framed the 51% as a gesture of love toward Tyler's future, never once mentioning Mark, never once mentioning Patricia Voss or Halvorsen and Reyes by name, painting herself as a mother who simply wanted security for her daughter's new household. It was, I'll admit, a genuinely good performance. If I hadn't spent 3 weeks building a folder against it, I might have almost believed her myself. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression that expected silence, or maybe a tearful apology for having reacted poorly at the wedding. I stood up instead. "Thank you, Diane," I said. "I'd like to clear the air too." I didn't raise my voice. I've found, over 11 years of difficult client calls, that volume reads as losing control, and stillness reads as certainty. "In October," I said, "a law firm called Halvorsen and Reyes contacted my business on behalf of an undisclosed family member, asking about a controlling stake in my company. I didn't see the email until after the wedding. I have it here." I set a printed copy on the table. Around the same time, someone contacted my bank's front desk asking general questions about my lending relationship. I have a letter from my banker confirming that inquiry happened and confirming the studio's entire financial history with that institution post-dates my divorce by years. Diane's face had gone very still. "My ex-husband," I continued, "told my son directly that he helped get the conversation started because he believes leaving 14 years ago entitles him to something now. I have texts confirming that conversation with his permission to share them because my son believes in honesty, even when it costs his own father something." And Diane built the 51% figure around an old laptop my ex-husband and I bought during our marriage. A laptop that was dead and discarded 18 months before I ever incorporated this company. I have the forensic technician's service report. I have every invoice from the studio's first year, proving every dollar came from my own labor, not from anything either of you contributed. I opened the folder and set it on the table in front of her, in front of everyone. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said. "This is 2 people who didn't build anything inside my company, deciding, the moment it became worth something, that they were owed a piece of it. One of them wanted money. You wanted control. And you both decided the best moment to ask was my son's wedding, in front of 90 people, because you thought grief or joy would make me too disoriented to say no clearly." Nobody at that table moved. Diane's real estate colleague, a woman named Joelle I recognized from the Lake Association newsletter, was staring at her quiche like it had personally betrayed her. "I'm not angry that you wanted something," I said, quieter now. "People want things. I'm angry that you built a case in secret for 8 months and chose to spend it in public, on a day that wasn't about you, in front of my son, who had no idea any of this was coming." Brianna, sitting beside Tyler, had her hand over her mouth. Tyler reached over and took her other hand, not to comfort her exactly. More like 2 people steadying each other through the same storm. Diane finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I was trying to protect my daughter's future." "No," I said. "You were trying to acquire a controlling stake in a company you've never set foot inside, using my son as the legal vehicle to get there. There's a difference, and everyone at this table just heard exactly what it is." I closed the folder. I'm not interested in a lawsuit, I said. I have one. I'm choosing not to use it today because Tyler and Brianna are still newly married, and I won't make their first year about this. But I want it understood by everyone sitting at this table that this conversation is finished, permanently. Mark, who had been sitting near the back of the tent the entire time, said nothing at all. He hadn't, I noticed, defended himself once. Since October, I said, and let that date sit in the air for a second before I went on. This folder includes a service report proving the laptop in question died in early 2014, 18 months before this company existed, and a replacement was bought afterward with my own freelance income. It includes 11 years of invoices showing every dollar that built this business came from clients, not from any marital account. And it includes a letter from my bank confirming our entire lending relationship started in 2018, 3 years after incorporation, based on the studio's own financials. Nobody at the table was eating anymore. There is no marital asset in this business, I said. There never was. The clause everyone's been quietly relying on for 8 months doesn't apply, and any attorney who actually reads this folder is going to tell you the same thing within an hour. I turned, not dramatically, just directly, toward Mark. I understand wanting to feel like the years you weren't here counted for something, I said. But you don't get to turn 14 years of being gone into a claim on the one thing I built specifically because you weren't here to help me build it. Mark didn't say anything. He looked at the tablecloth the way Brianna had looked at her napkin at the wedding, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to pity for him, brief and small, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. I turned to Diane last. And you don't get to call an ambush love just because you said the word family while you were doing it, I said. You had 8 months to have a conversation with me, directly, like an adult. You chose a wedding instead because you thought I'd be too disoriented to fight back in front of a crowd. I wasn't, and now everyone at this table has seen exactly what that decision actually was. I closed the portfolio. I'm not angry that you wanted to talk about the future, I said. Families do that. I'm angry about how and where and the 8 months you spent building a case instead of asking me a single honest question. I sat back down. Nobody clapped. Nobody was supposed to. The brunch ended quietly after that, the way gatherings do when the air's gone out of them. Diane didn't argue with the folder because there was nothing in it to argue with. Carol had made sure of that. Patricia Voss's office sent a brief letter 11 days later confirming the inquiry had been closed at the client's request. No apology came with it. I hadn't expected one. Mark left Madison 2 days after the brunch. He sent Tyler a single email before his flight, which Tyler showed me without my asking. 3 sentences. No real apology in them either. Just a line about hoping things could go back to normal eventually. Tyler wrote back 4 words. I don't know what they were, and I didn't ask. Diane and Brianna didn't speak for almost 2 months. They've started talking again since, carefully, the way people do after something cracks and doesn't fully reset. Brianna came to the studio on her own, without Tyler, about 6 weeks after the brunch, and stood in the doorway of my office on Wilson Street looking like she wasn't sure she was welcome. I should have told you what I knew, the second I knew it, she said. I was trying to keep the peace in my own family, and I let it cost you something in yours. I told her I appreciated her saying so. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, not entirely, and I've found that pretending things are fine, when they're not, is its own kind of dishonesty. But I did ask her to stay for coffee, and she did, and we talked for almost an hour about nothing related to ownership percentages at all. Her job, the apartment she and Tyler were fixing up, a dog they were thinking about adopting from the shelter on Vosges Road. It's not perfect. I don't think it's supposed to be. The studio is still mine, all of it. Renee still makes the coffee too strong on purpose. Greg still calls every March to check in about the lease renewal, the way he always has. And the old laptop, the one that started all of this without ever doing a single thing wrong, sits in a drawer in my office now instead of a closet. Not because I need it, but because some objects earn the right to be kept around a little longer than they're useful.